The moment someone tells you that you no longer belong in your own home, they have already forgotten who built the front door. Rebecca stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase, one hand resting on the polished oak railing, the other pointing toward the front entrance of the mansion we had shared for nearly 12 years. The chandelier above her scattered warm light across the foyer, catching the diamonds around her neck and making them sparkle brighter than the wedding ring she no longer seemed willing to wear with pride. Her friends stood frozen in the living room, wine glasses suspended halfway to their lips, pretending not to witness the end of a marriage while refusing to look away. My name is Daniel Brooks. I am 46 years old, born and raised in Dallas, Texas, and for most of my life I believed respect was stronger than money. That night, I learned money attracts attention, but respect is what keeps a family standing. Rebecca folded her arms and looked at me with an expression I barely recognized anymore. There was no sadness, no hesitation, only the quiet confidence of someone convinced she had already won. "You are not my husband anymore," she said, every word calm enough to sound rehearsed. The room fell completely silent. I could hear the soft hum of the climate control system echoing through the 12,000-square-foot house and the faint splash of water from the infinity pool beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. 12 years together, and somehow the loudest sound in that moment was my own heartbeat. Looking back, I should have argued. I should have demanded an explanation. That is what most people expected. Instead, I simply looked at her for several seconds, nodded once, removed my house keys from my pocket, and placed them gently on the entry table beneath a framed family photograph taken during happier years. "If that is truly how you feel," I said quietly, "then I will respect your decision." Her closest friend, Olivia Reed, let out a small laugh that she tried to hide behind her wine glass. Rebecca smiled without saying another word. They thought my silence meant surrender. They were wrong. I turned toward the front door, stepped into the warm Texas evening, and closed it behind me with the same care I had used every night for over a decade. No slammed doors, no shouting, no dramatic farewell. Some endings arrive with thunder. Others arrive so quietly that people do not realize everything has changed until the silence settles. I climbed into my black Range Rover, but did not start the engine immediately. Instead, I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact that had never needed more than a handful of conversations over the years. Samuel Harris, our estate manager, the man who had overseen every security system, every contractor, and every maintenance crew since the mansion had first been completed. He answered before the second ring. "Good evening, sir." His voice carried the same steady professionalism I had trusted for years. I looked back through the windshield at the illuminated house standing against the Dallas skyline like a monument to a life I thought would last forever. "Samuel," I said calmly, "activate Protocol 1. There was no surprise in his voice. "Understood, sir." The call ended. Exactly 28 minutes later, every access code connected to the estate was permanently replaced. Every digital credential was revoked. Every biometric authorization was updated. At 9:43 that evening, Rebecca walked toward the front entrance after saying goodbye to her friends, pressed her fingerprint against the security panel, and waited for the familiar click that never came. The gate lights remained green. The house remained beautifully lit, but the front door did not unlock. And that was the moment she discovered something she should have understood long before she ever told me I no longer belonged there. 6 weeks earlier, life still looked perfectly balanced from the outside. Every morning began the same way. The automatic shades lifted with the sunrise, fresh coffee filled the kitchen with its familiar aroma, and the Dallas skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls of the mansion that magazines had once called one of the city's finest private residences. I usually left for the office before 7, while Rebecca enjoyed slower mornings with her fitness trainer, charity committees, and luncheon meetings that seemed to multiply as our social circle grew wealthier. If someone had asked whether I was living the American dream, I probably would have answered yes without hesitation. Looking back now, I realize dreams rarely collapse overnight. They crack one quiet moment at a time until one day the entire foundation gives way. I started my business 22 years earlier from a rented warehouse no larger than a 2-car garage. I owned one used pickup truck, an aging laptop, and enough determination to keep working after every bank told me no. Success did not arrive quickly. There were years when every dollar mattered, Years when I measured progress by whether payroll cleared on Friday afternoons. Rebecca had been beside me through those difficult days. She celebrated every small victory, brought dinner to the office during late nights, and reminded me that temporary struggles did not define permanent outcomes. Those memories remained real, which made everything that happened later even harder to understand. As the company expanded, our lives changed in ways that seemed harmless at first. The warehouse became corporate headquarters. Business trips replaced weekend overtime. Invitations to charity galas replaced neighborhood cookouts. We purchased the mansion after closing the largest commercial real estate transaction of my career, and everyone congratulated us for finally reaching the level of success we had chased for so many years. The house overlooked a private lake, featured 12 bedrooms, a home theater, climate-controlled wine storage, and gardens maintained by a full-time landscaping crew. It was beautiful, but somewhere inside those polished marble halls, our conversations slowly became shorter. Rebecca no longer asked about contracts or new developments. Instead, she talked about exclusive memberships, designer renovations, and people whose approval suddenly seemed incredibly important. I told myself she was simply adjusting to a different lifestyle. That explanation felt easier than admitting something deeper might have changed. Then came the parties. At first they happened once every few months. Eventually they became almost weekly events. Executives, influencers, investors, and socialites wandered through our home carrying crystal glasses and speaking about luxury vacations, market trends, and private clubs. Rebecca looked completely at ease among them. I often stood quietly near the edge of those conversations, listening more than speaking. More than once I noticed her introducing the mansion with a phrase that caught my attention. She would smile proudly and say, "Welcome to my house." The first time I heard it, I assumed it was harmless. The second time, it lingered in my thoughts. By the fifth or sixth time, I realized she never once called it our home anymore. It was always hers. I never confronted her about those words because I believed respect could survive small misunderstandings. I was wrong. Sometimes the smallest sentences reveal the biggest changes long before anyone is willing to admit they are happening. The changes did not happen all at once. That was the dangerous part. If Rebecca had suddenly become a different person overnight, I would have noticed immediately. Instead, the distance arrived quietly, hiding inside ordinary moments that seemed too small to matter until they all connected into a picture I could no longer ignore. It started with little comments that sounded almost playful. During dinner with friends, she would laugh and tell people I worked too much to enjoy the life we had created. Everyone chuckled, including me. Then the jokes became sharper. She began introducing me as the man who was always chasing another deal, while she was the one who actually knew how to enjoy success. People laughed again. I smiled because I believed married couples were supposed to overlook small embarrassments. Looking back, I confused patience with permission. Every time I stayed silent, she became a little bolder. One Friday evening, we hosted a fundraising reception for a local children's hospital. Nearly 80 guests wandered through the ballroom, the terrace, and the gardens overlooking the lake. Waiters carried silver trays through the crowd, while a jazz quartet played softly beneath the covered patio. I had spent the afternoon finalizing a commercial acquisition worth more than $100 million before driving straight home, without even changing out of my business suit. As I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water, I heard Rebecca speaking with Olivia Reed and several other guests. Honestly, Rebecca laughed, Daniel would probably get lost if I let him organize anything in this house. The women laughed politely. He is brilliant with business, Olivia replied. But this place feels like your masterpiece. Rebecca smiled proudly. Exactly. I have turned this mansion into what it is. Without me, it would just be another expensive building. I stood in the hallway for a few seconds before quietly walking away. The words stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. She was not talking about decorating or hosting parties anymore. She was talking as though everything around us belonged to her alone. The pattern continued. Contractors no longer called me about renovations because Rebecca instructed them to communicate only with her. Interior designers referred to her as the homeowner. Event planners asked for her approval before making decisions, even though every invoice was still sent to my office. None of that bothered me financially. What unsettled me was how naturally everyone accepted the version of reality she presented. Even Samuel Harris noticed the shift. One afternoon, he respectfully asked whether the estate records should continue listing both of us as primary contacts or whether I preferred a different arrangement. I looked at him for several seconds before answering. Leave everything exactly as it is. He nodded once without another question, but something in his expression suggested he understood more than he was willing to say. Then came the evening that changed the way I viewed my own home forever. Rebecca hosted another gathering while I returned late from a meeting in Austin. As I entered through the front door, I heard her welcoming new guests with the same polished confidence she had perfected over the years. She lifted her champagne glass toward the grand staircase and smiled. "Make yourselves comfortable," she said. "After all, this is my house." This time, nobody corrected her. Neither did I. But for the first time, I stopped wondering whether she truly believed those words. I started wondering what she would do if one day she discovered they were never true. Looking back, I can trace the moment everything quietly changed, and it had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with attention. Success has a strange way of introducing people who admire your lifestyle far more than your character. As our company continued growing, invitations arrived almost every week. Charity galas, private dinners, luxury resort weekends, networking events where everyone smiled a little too easily and complimented things they had only seen for a few minutes. Rebecca embraced that world faster than I ever did. She knew every host by name, remembered birthdays, supported charities, and somehow became one of the most recognizable faces in circles I barely had time to attend. I admired her confidence because I believed we were still moving in the same direction. I never realized we had slowly begun walking on different roads. One afternoon, while reviewing contracts in my office downtown, Samuel Harris called. He rarely interrupted my work unless something truly required my attention. "Sir," he said respectfully, "the interior design team requested approval to renovate the West Wing." Mrs. Brooks instructed them to begin immediately. I thanked him and told him to let the work continue. The renovation itself did not concern me. What stayed with me was his next sentence. "The contractors asked whether your authorization was still necessary. They were informed the property decisions belong exclusively to Mrs. Brooks." I leaned back in my chair without answering for several seconds. It was not the first time someone assumed Rebecca made every decision concerning the estate. It was simply the first time another person quietly wondered whether my approval mattered at all. That evening, I returned home just before sunset. Rebecca was standing beside the infinity pool with Olivia, discussing furniture for another outdoor reception. As I walked toward them, Olivia smiled politely before saying something that stopped me in my tracks. "You have incredible taste, Rebecca. Honestly, I always forget Daniel even owns this place." Rebecca laughed softly before taking another sip of sparkling water. "Sometimes I forget too," she replied. Neither woman noticed I had heard the conversation. I stood there only long enough to understand one uncomfortable truth. Rebecca did not correct the statement. She accepted it as though it reflected reality. I quietly turned around and walked back inside the house. The marble floors echoed beneath my footsteps, and for the first time since we moved into the mansion, it felt less like a home and more like a carefully decorated hotel where I happened to know every hallway. Later that night, I found our original house plans stored inside the library cabinet where I had placed them years earlier. I unfolded the large architectural drawings across the desk, remembering every decision that had gone into building the estate from bare ground. Every window had been positioned to capture the evening light over the lake. Every stone had been selected after months of planning. Every security system, every utility connection, every structural detail had been reviewed countless times before construction even began. Rebecca had enjoyed choosing paint colors, artwork, and furniture, but the legal structure behind the property had always been handled elsewhere. She never asked about trusts, holding companies, liability protection, or ownership documents because those conversations bored her. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Looking back, I realized she had spent years living inside a house whose foundation she admired but never truly understood. And somewhere deep inside me, a quiet realization began taking shape. Respect had not disappeared in a single argument. It had been leaving one unnoticed assumption at a time. The hardest part was not watching my marriage change. The hardest part was realizing I had been the last person to see it happening. The next morning, I canceled every meeting on my calendar except one. My assistant looked surprised because I almost never changed my schedule without a reason. I simply told her I needed a few uninterrupted hours away from the office. Instead of driving downtown, I headed toward a quiet brick building overlooking White Rock Lake, where I had not been in almost 3 years. The name on the glass door read Turner and Associates. Michael Turner had represented my company since the early days when every contract felt like a gamble and every lawsuit could have ended everything I had worked to build. He greeted me with the same firm handshake and calm smile he always had. "You look tired, Daniel," he said. I smiled faintly. I finally noticed something I should have seen a long time ago. He did not ask for details immediately. Good attorneys understand that facts arrive more clearly after silence. We sat across from each other inside a conference room lined with shelves of legal binders collected over decades. I explained everything. The parties, the comments, Rebecca introducing the mansion as her house, the growing distance between appearance and reality. Michael listened without interrupting, occasionally making a short note on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands together. "What would you like to accomplish?" he asked. I thought about the question carefully before answering. "I am not here to punish anyone," I said. "I simply want to make certain the legal reality matches whatever future she chooses." He nodded once. "Then we begin by reviewing everything." For the next 3 hours, we examined ownership records, trust agreements, operating companies, estate documents, insurance policies, and security authorizations. Nothing had been neglected. Years earlier, when the mansion was built, Michael had recommended placing the property inside a carefully structured holding company designed to protect both the estate and my business interests from unnecessary liability. Rebecca had signed every document presented to her without asking many questions because she trusted me completely at the time. Ironically, that same trust had quietly preserved the legal structure now sitting inside the folders spread across the conference table. Michael looked up from the final document. "Nothing needs to be changed," he said. "Everything is already exactly where it belongs." His answer surprised me. Somehow I expected dramatic legal maneuvers or complicated paperwork. Instead, the truth had been sitting in place for years, unnoticed because no one had ever bothered to look beyond appearances. Before leaving his office, I asked him to prepare one sealed envelope containing certified copies of every document related to the mansion. He did not ask why. He simply said they would be ready whenever I needed them. That afternoon, I made one final stop before returning home. Samuel Harris met me inside the estate security office tucked discreetly behind the main garage. Monitors displayed every entrance, hallway, gate, and perimeter camera surrounding the property. Samuel stood patiently beside the control console while I reviewed the access system. "If I ever instruct you to activate Protocol 1, I asked quietly, "how long would the transition require?" Samuel answered without hesitation. "Approximately 30 minutes, sir. Every code, biometric credential, gate authorization, and remote access profile would be replaced immediately." I nodded slowly. "Good." He studied my expression for a brief moment before speaking again. "May I ask whether something is wrong?" I looked through the security monitors toward the mansion where Rebecca was hosting another afternoon gathering on the terrace overlooking the lake. Laughter drifted faintly across the gardens. "Not yet," I replied. "But I have learned that strong doors are never installed after the storm begins. They are prepared long before anyone realizes the weather has changed." 3 days passed without a single argument. That almost frightened me more than the tension itself. Rebecca continued living exactly as though nothing had changed. Every afternoon, another luxury SUV appeared in the circular driveway. Caterers came and went through the service entrance. Florists delivered fresh arrangements twice a week. The mansion looked as perfect as ever, but perfection has a way of hiding fractures until the pressure becomes too great to ignore. I stopped trying to convince myself we were simply going through a difficult season. Instead, I began paying attention. The strange thing about quiet observation is that people eventually reveal everything when they believe nobody is watching. Rebecca no longer asked where I spent my workdays. She no longer wondered why I occasionally returned later than usual or why I carried a leather portfolio into my home office every evening. She assumed I was consumed by another acquisition. In reality, every document inside that portfolio had already been reviewed, certified, and organized by Michael Turner. Every legal record sat exactly where it needed to be should anyone ever question ownership. There were no dramatic meetings, no secret negotiations, only careful preparation built upon decisions made years before. One Thursday evening, I found Samuel walking the property with the landscaping supervisor, inspecting outdoor lighting before another reception Rebecca planned to host. As I joined him near the fountain overlooking the lake, he quietly handed me a maintenance report. "Everything is operating normally, sir," he said. Then he hesitated for a brief moment before adding, "The security transition has been tested exactly as requested." I nodded once. "Any issues?" "None," he replied. "If Protocol 1 is ever activated, every authorization will update within 30 minutes. Existing credentials will become invalid immediately afterward." His voice remained completely professional, but I noticed the question in his eyes. He still did not ask why. Loyalty often sounds like silence. That same night, Rebecca invited several friends for another private dinner. I stayed upstairs finishing emails while laughter drifted through the open foyer below. Around 9 o'clock, I walked toward the staircase, intending to say goodnight before returning to work. I stopped halfway down when I heard Olivia speaking. "You really are lucky, Rebecca. Most women spend years trying to build this kind of life." Rebecca smiled as a server refilled her glass. "Luck had very little to do with it," she answered confidently. "Some people know how to recognize opportunity." Olivia glanced around the mansion with obvious admiration. "I cannot imagine ever leaving a place like this." Rebecca laughed softly. "Neither can I. And honestly, I do not think anyone could ever make me leave." The conversation moved on, but her words stayed with me long after the guests departed. They were not cruel. They were simply certain. Certainty can be dangerous when it rests on assumptions instead of facts. The following afternoon, Michael called to confirm the certified document package was complete. I thanked him and placed the sealed envelope inside the locked drawer of my office desk. I hoped I would never need it. I truly did. But hope is not a strategy, and experience had taught me that protecting what you build is not an act of revenge. It is an act of responsibility. As I drove home beneath the fading Texas sunset, I had no idea the conversation waiting inside those marble walls would arrive sooner than any of us expected. Before the weekend ended, one sentence would erase 12 years of marriage, and one quiet decision would change everything that followed. By the time I pulled into the circular driveway that Saturday evening, the mansion was already glowing beneath rows of landscape lights that reflected across the lake like scattered pieces of gold. Luxury sedans lined the entrance while valet attendants guided another wave of guests toward the front doors. Rebecca had organized what she described as a small celebration. Although nearly 50 people filled the ballroom, the terrace, and every corner of the main floor. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. Servers carried silver trays filled with appetizers, and laughter echoed beneath ceilings I had spent years designing with architects who believed a home should feel timeless. Looking back, it amazes me how quickly a familiar place can begin feeling unfamiliar. I walked inside, greeted several business associates, and accepted a glass of sparkling water before quietly making my way through the crowd. Rebecca stood near the grand staircase, surrounded by Olivia and several friends, looking completely at ease as she welcomed every new arrival. She noticed me almost immediately, but the warm smile she once reserved for me never appeared. Instead, she gave the same polite nod she offered distant acquaintances. I told myself not to overthink it. Then everything changed. One of our guests jokingly asked when we planned to host another anniversary party. The question seemed harmless. Rebecca laughed softly before answering in a tone so calm that nobody realized they were about to witness the end of something important. "There will not be another anniversary," she said. A few people chuckled, assuming she was teasing. She was not. She turned toward me with complete composure, her expression almost emotionless. "Daniel," she said, "we both know this marriage has been over for a long time." The conversations around us faded into silence. Every face slowly turned in our direction. I stood perfectly still, waiting for her to reconsider. She never did. "You are not my husband anymore," she continued. "You just have not accepted it yet." The words landed quietly, but they carried the weight of a collapsing building. Olivia lowered her glass without speaking. A couple standing beside the fireplace exchanged uncomfortable glances before looking away. Nobody interrupted because nobody knew how. I studied Rebecca's face for several long seconds. There was no anger in her eyes, only certainty. Somehow that hurt more than shouting ever could have. I reached into my pocket, removed my keys, and placed them carefully on the console table beneath the family portrait hanging in the foyer. The metal touched the wood with a sound so small that it somehow filled the entire room. "If that is truly how you feel," I said calmly, "then I will respect your decision." I turned toward the front entrance without another word. No accusations. No dramatic speech. No attempt to convince someone to stay after they had already decided to leave. As I stepped outside, the warm Texas air felt strangely peaceful compared to the silence behind me. I climbed into my Range Rover and closed the door gently. For several seconds, I simply watched the lights shining through the mansion windows where the life I had spent decades building continued without me. Then I unlocked my phone and called the one person I trusted to carry out instructions without emotion or hesitation. Samuel answered immediately. "Good evening, sir." I looked back at the house one final time before speaking 4 words that had remained untouched for years. "Activate Protocol 1 now." "Understood, sir," he replied. The line disconnected. I started the engine and drove away, knowing that within 30 minutes every assumption inside that mansion would begin colliding with reality. Exactly 28 minutes after I ended the call, Samuel completed the final security verification from the estate control room. He did not rush. He followed the same procedure he had practiced countless times during emergency drills. Only this time the protocol was no longer theoretical. Every gate authorization was replaced. Every keypad code was regenerated. Every biometric profile except the active ownership credentials was removed from the system. Cameras remained online. Lighting remained exactly the same. Nothing about the mansion appeared different from the outside. That was the point. Real change rarely announces itself. It simply becomes reality while everyone is still expecting the old rules to apply. Rebecca stayed behind after most of the guests had left, laughing with Olivia as they walked slowly across the marble foyer toward the front entrance. She waved goodbye to the last valet, stepped outside to enjoy the warm Texas evening, and continued talking beneath the covered portico for several more minutes. Eventually, Olivia hugged her and drove away. Rebecca turned back toward the front door carrying her phone and evening purse with the relaxed confidence of someone returning to a place she believed would always welcome her. She pressed her thumb against the biometric reader beside the entrance. The scanner flashed red. She frowned slightly before trying again. Another red light. Then a soft electronic tone echoed through the quiet night. "Access denied." She stared at the display for several seconds as though the machine had made an impossible mistake. She entered her personal security code. Invalid. She tried a second code. Invalid. A third attempt produced the same comm message across the touchscreen. Authorization not recognized. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared on her face. She reached for her phone. Just as the front door opened from the inside, Samuel stepped onto the front porch wearing the same dark suit he always wore while managing the estate. His expression remained respectful, but there was unmistakable professionalism in the distance he maintained. "Good evening, Mrs. Brooks," he said calmly. "Mr. Brooks instructed me to provide this to you." He extended a sealed ivory envelope bearing the letterhead of Turner and Associates. Rebecca accepted it without speaking. Her hands remained perfectly steady until she unfolded the first page. I was several miles away when Michael called to confirm the documents had been delivered exactly as instructed. I thanked him quietly before pulling my vehicle onto an overlook above the Dallas skyline. From there I could see the distant lights stretching across the city where I had spent more than 2 decades building everything people admired. My phone vibrated again only moments later. "Samuel." "Sir," he said respectfully, "Mrs. Brooks has reviewed the letter." "Is everything peaceful?" I asked. "Yes, sir." She requested entry. He paused briefly before continuing. I explained that the estate can only be accessed with written authorization from the legal owner or by court order. I closed my eyes for a moment. There was no satisfaction in hearing those words, only sadness for how we had arrived there. The letter contained nothing cruel. No insults. No threats. Only certified copies confirming the mansion belonged to Brooks Estate Holdings, a company solely controlled by me under documents signed years before construction had even begun. Rebecca had signed every supporting acknowledgement during closing because she trusted the legal advisors handling our affairs. She had simply never cared enough to read beyond the signature pages. Now every assumption she had repeated for years had collided with a single fact that required no argument. Ownership had never belonged to the loudest voice inside the house. It belonged to the person who had quietly carried the responsibility for it all along. The following morning, I returned to the estate just after sunrise. The first light reflected across the lake exactly as it had. Every morning for years, turning the water into a sheet of gold that stretched toward the eastern sky. From a distance, nothing looked different. The stone walls still stood with quiet elegance. The gardens remained perfectly trimmed. The fountain continued flowing beside the circular driveway. Yet I understood something I had not fully realized before. A house can remain unchanged while the life inside it transforms forever. Samuel met me at the entrance with the same calm professionalism he had shown throughout the previous evening. "Good morning, sir," he said before handing me a small folder containing the overnight security report. There had been no arguments, no damaged property, no dramatic confrontation. Rebecca had eventually accepted transportation to a nearby luxury hotel after speaking briefly with Michael Turner by telephone. Everything had unfolded peacefully. I thanked Samuel and walked slowly through the front doors. The silence inside the mansion felt unfamiliar after so many years of constant gatherings and conversations. Every room held memories. The library where Rebecca and I once planned our future together. The breakfast room where we celebrated my first major business acquisition. The terrace where we watched countless sunsets believing success alone could protect happiness. I finally understood that success can build beautiful walls, but it cannot build respect. That part must be chosen every single day. Around noon, Rebecca asked if we could meet. Michael arranged the meeting at his office instead of the house. She arrived wearing a simple navy jacket with almost no jewelry, looking very different from the confident woman who had stood beneath the chandelier only one night earlier. We sat across from each other for several quiet moments before she finally spoke. "I never thought this would happen," she admitted softly. I nodded. "Neither did I." She looked down at the papers resting in front of her. "Was this your revenge?" she asked. I answered honestly. "No. Revenge tries to humiliate someone. This was simply accepting the decision you made." She remained silent for several long seconds before asking one final question. "When did you stop fighting for us?" I looked at her with more sadness than anger. "I never stopped," I replied. "I only stopped trying to convince someone to stay after they had already decided to leave." No one raised a voice. No one blamed the other for every mistake. Some stories do not end with dramatic speeches. They end with quiet acceptance. As I walked back toward my vehicle, I realized the mansion had never been the most valuable thing I owned. Neither was the company, the investments, nor the land surrounding the lake. The most valuable thing I ever possessed was the ability to leave bitterness behind without allowing it to define the rest of my life. A locked door was never the real ending of our marriage. That door simply reflected a truth that had existed long before the security system changed. Homes are not protected by stone, steel, or expensive technology. They are protected by trust, gratitude, and mutual respect. The night those things disappeared, the house stopped being our home long before anyone found themselves standing outside the front entrance. I drove away without looking back again because some chapters deserve one final sentence and nothing more. Respect built everything I had. Pride nearly destroyed it. In the end, only one of them remained standing.